This is an interview for the oral history program of the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and the date is September 7th, 2006. We're in the Julian Zamora Library on the University of Notre Dame campus, and the interviewer will be Tracy Grimm, archivist for the Institute for Latino Studies, and I will be interviewing artist and retired faculty member of Eastern Washington University, Ruben Trejo. Thank you, Ruben, for participating in our oral history program. And could you please state your full name, your date and place of birth for us?
Okay, my name is Ruben Trejo. I was born in January 7th of 1937 in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Thank you. And I want to thank you so much for agreeing to participate in our program, for taking the time with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I want to start by asking you a few questions, or to ask you to talk about your family background, where you grew up, your parents, your siblings.
Okay. As I mentioned, I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota. I went to school there. To start with, my folks were originally from Mexico. My dad came very early in probably the 10s or 20s. Worked for the railroad. My mother came much later. And they gave birth to 11 kids, and of which four of them died something closer to birth. And anyway, what was I going to mention? My mother was mostly house homework, and we did as kids. We did a lot of migrant work around Minnesota and North Dakota, picking potatoes, onions, and sugar beets. And actually, we did come to Kokomo, Indiana once to pick tomatoes when we were kids. So we got a little more, camping. They call summer camping. That was really funny. But the camping we were doing was we had to do with work.
Was that in the 40s?
That would be in the 40s, yeah, and the early 50s. And about the early 50s, we quit. And my brothers got older. They got jobs in the city, and we didn't return anymore at that stage. So lifestyles were changed in that time. To go back a little bit as far as education, I think it's kind of important. I grew up in the area of St. Paul where we were the only Mexican Americans going to the school. So it's a whole different attitude growing up, because usually if you see other people of your own kind, there's a different conditions in terms of social upbringing. And that was strange because it sort of left you outside of the process of the community. Although there was a Mexican community, and we did go over there and make friends, but usually on a daily basis it was going to this type of school.
So there were other Mexican families, but just not in the area.
In the area, right? You're right. Where we were, we were mostly in area where, again, it's strange again because we grew up with people who are Norwegian Swedish background, which is basically what a good part of Minnesota and German. So that was part of it.
How did your parents negotiate between those, the two cultures, preserving the culture they brought with them and passing it on to you and your brothers and sisters, and this new?
It was interesting because most of those people that did come to the United States, immigrants, all spoke Spanish, so they huddled around the little community and spoke to each other, the mothers, dads, and everything was kind of transacted in Spanish. As I grew up, my mother particularly did not learn English, and she never wanted us to speak to her in English. So we always came home and spoke Spanish. We go to school and speak English. And the way we were taught English was my older brother learned English, and then eventually, as we went to school, we all, began to speak English. I remember at kindergarten, first grade, my older brother had to come and translate things for the teacher because I wasn't getting the ideas or whatever it was in English. So it was that type of thing, which is good and bad. One, at least you can learn how to speak a language and you can think in that language, very young. And the second one, there's nobody to correct you to create, for Spanish or English. So there was, there's a downside to that, was a kind of a problem.
Your schooling, you went to college in Minnesota?
Right.
And
Yes.
studied.
Yes, I started out at the University of Minnesota. I took a couple of night classes because you know, my grades weren't that great when I was in high school, and although I was really interested in reading and writing, but what happened was I took a class. I think it was in music theory, and I got a B, and I thought, oh God, that's not hard. That's very difficult. Not very difficult. But of course, I started out as a musician, so I had a little background to what music was about.
When did you start playing?
I think it was about 1950s, somewhere there. And I played with bands around that area,
What instrument?
Saxophone.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And I should mention, for historical information, there is a pamphlet that's put out by the Minnesota Historical Society called Mexicans in America, in Minnesota, and it has a whole kind of background in the kind of community I grew up with, for anybody who would like to look into it or needs more information about that community and how it developed. And anyway, I started out at the University of Minnesota, and then I went to the 2-year college there, general college. I went through getting some basic elements I needed. I transferred over to the 4-year college, and then eventually went on to graduate, get an MFA at the University of Minnesota in sculpture. Yeah.
And what year?
It took me roughly, I'd say, almost 10 years for this reason, because I financed the whole thing. I got a job, and sometimes I would have money, and sometimes I was disillusioned with education, and I kept running back and forth. Eventually, I made it over a period of time. So it was people keep, at least in my background, they kept saying, God, you're going to retire at the University of Minnesota. But it was, I enjoyed it. Maybe because I also kept taking classes I didn't need for my graduation, because I really was interested in getting, quote, education at the time. So I take classes like in humanities. I didn't need the classes, and anthropology, a few other ones like this that were not required. I had, literature, world literature. I love world literature. I took a whole series of classes on those. But that type of thing, I was kind of leaning. And then I took a minor in Latin American literature because it was a language that I did, I could speak, but I didn't know that much about what the language was about. So, I got a little bit catching up through those kind of processes.
And so that was probably the 1960s when you were doing your MFA?
Yeah, late 50s, early 60s. Yeah, I got my my MFA in 1968.
And the other night when we were talking, you spoke a little bit about the academic environment in the arts at the MFA program.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how that was, how you negotiated being an artist and doing the kinds of work that you wanted to do, and what that academic?
There were several ways to go. One, who were the, quote, people I was looking to that I could relate to? And some of them were the Mexican muralists. At the same time, the system is asking you to look at Main Street American art. And so there was kind of a flux ideas of, Andy Warhol, the American abstract expressionist, the minimalist, and all these other artists that were becoming part of the American landscape in the 60s. And at the same time, I kept thinking, well, those are really interesting. I did like them. There's no problem with these artists. But there's also the process of, it's like taking from a culture and trying to make it your own, which is very difficult. And I think it's, if you did that attitude, it was, well, here's a Mexican American just taking art, from abstract expressions or what have you. So it wasn't really something that I fundamentally grew up with. I mean, I knew about it. It's like most things that you know about European art, but you don't certainly paint like European artists. And anyway, so it was a matter of also at this stage of the game that art was also confronting the idea of the personal thing, which was coming out in the late 60s, 70s. Who are you as an American? What's this identity crisis? And then I touched on some of the Chicano movements that were happening in California, which again, it's interesting because I'm way over in Minnesota, and all these other kinds of activities that's happening around the border Texas, California, Arizona, Southwest, and there was nothing over there at the time.
So were you making connections to?
Eventually, yeah, I made more connections when I arrived at the state of Washington because there was a little more activity in Seattle. And Tomas Ibarra Frosta was there at the time. And in fact, I really have to thank him for all the connections he made for me and helped me make. And then eventually I contacted part of the California artists, and I became part of exhibitions, traveling exhibition like Gara exhibition, and some from the Mexican Museum in Chicago, and a few other ones that it's sprouted out in that area. And it was nice because just recently, coming to this conference here, I finally met some of the artists that were in the exhibition, and I never knew them till just recently, Montoya and and a few other ones. And so it was really interesting being here for this conference.
That's Malachias Montoya.
Right, right. Yeah. Thank you, because there's a lot of Montoyas. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Mm. Oh, interesting. So you began teaching at Minnesota and then moved to?
Yeah, I taught 5 years at St. Teresa's College in Winona, Minnesota, which was, again, a woman's finishing school, really. That's really what it was about. And then I got a job at teaching at Eastern Washington University. In '73, I moved to Spokane, Washington. And I've been there for 30 years.
So that was
and I retired about in '03. Yeah.
So you were teaching sculpture and fine arts mostly?
Originally, what I was teaching was art and humanities, which is really a more, the kind of Western civilization series of art, starting with the Egyptians, cave paintings, and all the other stuff. So I did that for a whole period, for some time. I was hired to do that, and drawing. And then eventually there was a position of sculpture, and I took over in that area. But I taught a variety of different classes. I left Mexican and Chicano art. I did a whole series of those when I was there. So again, because slowly I became acquainted with the movements, the artists, through those kind of methods. So like self-development in those areas.
And was Tomas teaching at the university?
He was teaching at U of W in Seattle. Eventually, he moved from there to Stanford University, and we kept contact through there. Yes.
We can move to talk about your artwork a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe we could use a specific piece
mm-hmm.
that I was looking at to talk about some of the themes that you work with.
Mm-hmm.
And that piece I found was the Codex for the 21st Century, which is part of the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Right.
And I'll give you a picture.
Yes.
That's not a very good printout, but and I was, it reminds me in a sense of some of the pieces we have here in the exhibit. That it speaks a little bit to geography in a sense, with the railroad spots,
yeah.
and back to issues of identity and
mm-hmm.
geography. If you could just speak a little bit.
Okay. What was interesting about this piece, at least when I was making it, it is about 200 nails. I'll talk about the construction of it. 200 nails that were bent and welded together in couples of 2. So you land up with roughly 100 of these groupings of this, like you see, that's in the composition. And what I did was I welded a little kind of nail in the back. So all you had to do was drill a hole at every 12 inches, I believe, and then put it in the wall. And then you could take it off and put it in a box for shipment. And you could do it anyway. So it didn't matter where you put them. So it was a very flexible piece, because which one's left or right, it didn't matter. Just take one, opened up the box and put them on the wall. And you would have a mural that was about 20 feet by 5 feet. So So that's the way it was. And I liked it because I thought that always the problems with sculpture is that if it gets too big, how do you ship it? And this one I could put in a box a little bigger than this and then send it off. And so that's the reason for it. And the other thought was I wanted to create some kind of, it's codex for the 21st century, a kind of a language that nobody knew where it came from. I'll give you an example of this. I was supposed to give a presentation to Laura Bush and Martha Fox in Chicago on this piece. The exhibition was traveling, it was in Chicago. And I said, what the hell am I going to say? All groups of people, of women that were coming through. And I'm going, oh my God. Anyway, I sat there and I said, I tried to invent a language in this piece where there was no key to it. And therefore, it was a language that mankind cannot use against each other to create wars. And I said, then the next question is, what is it then? And I said, well, let's put it this way. It goes into the realm of art. And really, in art, it's more about making things that are about love. It's romantic in some ways. So that, don't try to find any necessarily meaning in these pieces because they're not. And strangely enough, too, the pieces itself, because there were couples of them, at least on the part of some viewers, felt that it had to do with the Kama Sutra. Because these couples see them. And the interesting thing about the nails, okay, you have 12-inch spiked nails.
12 inch.
Okay, yeah, and they're bent. And it's strange again because as soon as you bend the nails, they become more feminine. Because a straight line is very, harsh. And of course, what is a nail for? And when they are bent, they lose their function. And they become something else. So that's the story behind those groups. Then I later did some with railroad spikes, which are at the Hispanic Museum in Albuquerque, which were built on the idea of creating a language again of through just the spikes itself. And so it was a really challenging idea. And they're done in squares, 8 around, so create a square. And inside the square, there's little figuratives or bent ones or pieces that are broken and are welded together. And so they create almost kind of a strange, as you see the whole group, it creates a hypnotic thing because your eye doesn't focus on one, but the whole pattern. And the same thing with this nail one, to get back to the Smithsonian one. You look at it, and it's the shadows and all the other things that are about it that create a sense of mystery, that give it a ambience, And this is what was so interesting about the piece they have here with spikes that is in the show. When I looked at it, wow, they really did a beautiful job of photographing it. You're right, right. Yes, because the shadows are so beautiful on that. And I went, wow, this is really great. Yeah.
It takes on a life of
right,
its own, depending on
and just to go back to this, it was a matter of creating, again, in these pieces, a language which, again, people were trying to find some meaning. And again, I should mention the one in the National Hispanic Museum in Chicago. You can take those and put them any way, on the wall. It doesn't, there's no particular 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, I like that whole idea of having that kind of freedom. Also, because you don't not necessarily, like the one at Smithsonian, it doesn't necessarily be square. You can take those and create a long line of them, or go up, or create different configurations, depending on how the museum wants to use it. So I allow that kind of freedom to the curator to play with it. So, in other words, they too become part of the artwork and making it in the process. So it's spread out that way.
And you mentioned the other piece that you mentioned with railroad spikes, and that did your father work on the railroad? You grew up around the railroad?
Yes, we were. Right. To get back again, birth element. On my birth certificate, it says born on a boxcar, CB and Q boxcar. What the railroad company did was take boxcars off, put them in a little kind of island of boxcars. And we had railroad tracks on both sides of our house. So as we grew up, we grew up with the sounds of the railroads. And in this particular boxcar, originally we had gasoline lamps. Eventually we had electrical lights, and of course all the water was outside. You had to go to the bathroom outside, and it wasn't nice going to the bathroom in Minnesota when it's 25, 30 below zero. Believe me, it's not. So I mean, it's strange when you look back how the survival skills that you have to go through in life, and eventually when you grow up, you get bathrooms inside the house and all that stuff, and water, hot water, and all the other stuff. Yeah, hot water again, you have to warm up the stoves, and just a little picture of what the inside of the house was. We had these big giant coal stoves, and my mother used to bake tortillas, and my dad baked pancakes in the morning. So it was really handy, especially with all the brothers. We have to sit there and fight for the tortillas, and who gets the next pancake. So, right. Yeah, right. And interesting about it, because we lived, as I said before, Mount Spark area in St. Paul, which was about like 3 miles from school. We had to walk that. There were no buses. And I still remember, they bundled us, going to kindergarten, going through the coal area. My God, I think back of it, just putting on the snowsuits to get there. When you're about 5, 6 years old, my God, the snowdrifts are pretty high. But we survived all that, which is. But at the same time, when you look back at it, we also enjoyed the winters by going sliding, sleds and skating, all these other areas that children do when they're in Minnesota at that time. So.
If I could ask you also about the exhibit you have here at Notre Dame right now, Azatlan and Beyond. It seems, again, sort of the theme of geography that I think maybe I heard you talk about this in the gallery talk. The idea of geography and railroads coming in and going back to the pre-Columbian figures and the idea of, well, I guess, could you talk a little bit about how this works?
Okay, I should mention also a little bit of philosophy about my work in reference to these pieces, okay? Because I've never really have focused necessarily just on Chicano work. I think it's very limiting. Also, in terms of American art, it's very limiting because you have to focus in on certain areas. So I took a larger piece of what I call the inheritance in my life, which is both Spanish and pre-Columbian ones, and then of course in this country, American, European, British background. So you line up with all these kind of cultural elements. What do you do with them? And going to the University of Minnesota, you take art history classes in the Renaissance, but they were the pre-Columbian ones, at least. I mean, maybe at anthropology at that time, but they were not around at the time. And also, a good part of my education had to do with European. When you realize, particularly in literature, what does Russian literature have to do with picking grapes or picking onions or something else? So you can see the kind of discrepancies between lifestyles and thought process. And I think I've mentioned that before. How do you survive all this and make it work for you? One, you can join the Nut House, or you can become an artist, and I decided to become an artist. It's safe. It saved me from going crazy with all these, because you bundle up all these thoughts, and all of us, when you start realizing how much information we gather in our head, some of you would like to forget, which you could go at night and rub some of it off and goodbye, because you don't need it. There's a lot of information you need. At the same time, it gives you a more universal look, through literature, through arts, or what have you, look at it. And I try to utilize that as an idea. And from there, I could just deduce what I wanted to do. Okay, to get back to this one, I thought Gilbert stopped by, and I was doing a comedies. He stopped by in Spokane and saw those things. So, yeah, those are kind of interesting. I'd like to see some more of them. So I started working on them, and then I sent him a CD, and he said, yeah, let's have a show of it. And And that's how it came out. Now, to get back to it, how does this work out? Well, one of the things, too, as I took maps, particularly of the Southwest, I thought, well, I'll do California, Colorado, and Texas, those areas. Some of the early immigrants who came to it, or were there early before the United States had taken them over. And eventually you start realizing they spread out throughout the United States. You find them in North Carolina, New York, Minnesota, Washington, and what have you. And so I thought, what I'll do is kind of a drawing on top of the map so that the viewer can relate to the map and see cities that he might be from. Just for example, Dr. Simon, who was around, mentioned one of California. He said, I would like to have one of California with Long Beach because I have a friend there, and I want to mail it to the friend. I said, oh yeah, I'll make you one. I think I have one at home. But anyway, what was interesting when I took ink and pens and started doing some drawings on top of the map, so they look like they're ghosts that are coming out. And I have them where I rearrange geography and faces and ideas. For example, I think I have Zapata in California. He never was in California, or Minnesota, I forgot which state. So anyway, some of these are titled in reference to the state, or maybe I had my dad going to Kansas City, which supposedly he had spent some time in Kansas City before he came to Minnesota. So, and other ones where I've just been having a lot of fun. Other ones, for example, I heard in a story about Oregon. There was a person there who was from Mexico, but did not speak Spanish, and obviously did not speak English, and they were having a hell of a problem. They invited, people to translate from Spanish. The guy did not speak Spanish, and they thought the guy must be crazy because wobbling with the language nobody understood, and it was really indigenous language from Oaxaca. They felt, oh my God, So it's strange again, and perhaps some of those pieces with the Pre-Columbian have to do with that one situation about it, which is interesting because you have a whole reference to it. Also because I love Pre-Columbian art and the idea of indigenous people moving north, looking for a livelihood. All of a sudden, the reservations or the areas and economic survivals in Mexico are very rough for them, and the only way they can do it is to come up to this country and get a job. So, and then the other ones like Pancho Villa, they become kind of heroes of the revolutionary period, and the Pre-Columbian figures. And I should mention, my next series is going to be with more contemporary people for the 21st century, Santana, J-Lo, and a whole series of other people like this that are living today. So I will start utilizing the idea of immigration, and it has to do with that attitude. Now, what's interesting about it, I took kind of historical things, rearranged the time elements, put them on space and time, and gave them a new life that they never had. And that's a creative process because people say, well, he never was there. Yeah, you're right. But it's symbolic of the larger group of people that came, not necessarily that he was in Minnesota, Because the reason I put them in Minnesota is because when I was growing up, I remember my dad and some of his friends talking about the revolution that they had been in. Yeah, so that's how all this information came about. It was there somewhere along the line in my memory bank, and so that was part of that.
What area of Mexico were?
They were from Michoacan. Yeah. And as I said, and I should mention as part of education earlier, I did spend some time in 1940. I went to school in Mexico. We did spend some time going back and forth to Mexico because my dad worked for the railroad. So we get free passes all the way to Laredo, Texas, and then from there out, we had to pay for it. But, so I got a little view of Mexico, say in 42, I was about 5 years old, of what Mexico is about. And just to, go back to that period, I remember we arrived at the train station in La Barca, Jalisco, and to get to my grandmother's house, we had to take a mule thing because it was the rainy season. So there were no roads. And when we got there were just candles. There were no electric lights. So we got a little taste of Mexico, which I sort of conjecture that those towns were much like what the Spaniards left. I mean, the adobe houses with no radios, that type of thing, no telephones, so communication's gone. But it gives you a whole different feeling of experience, it's a challenge to kind of look around and see what the kind of world that you're in. And I'm sure that if you go in different parts of Latin America, I know I was in Guatemala, and my God, just recently, and my God, they're really rural. I mean, it almost has the same effect of Mexico in that respect.
Can I ask you about your father and his recollections of the revolution?
What I was going to mention, they talked about all these different campaigns. It didn't make that much sense when you were 5 or 6 years old because it didn't, or even up to 10. We always, you're growing up. Well, that was their story. You're also in that kind of a English, Spanish combinations and listening to. It made more sense to them. There was one fellow who was working on the railroad that supposedly my dad captured when they were doing the revolutionary situation, So because this guy was playing, or under the auspice of Pancho Villa or Zapata or some of the other heroes of the time. So it's really interesting to listen to. I do remember one that my mother said when she was 8, 9 years old. They had to go out in the field and bandaged up some of these soldiers. So the women were very involved in the Mexican Revolution, and you find this in some of the murals of Orozco. Where you find women along following the men. Also, some of the photographs at Casola, who has again women in trains, along with the men. So, there's a sense of the whole nation up in arms over the revolution. Yeah. And what else? To get back again, there's very little information on that stays in my head because I said before it was too personal on the part of my dad and his friends, other than little anecdotes. Yeah. And interesting, very quickly too, the was my dad supposedly spoke about, according to my brother, about 4 different dialogues of Indian languages. And they once in a while they would get and talk in Tarascan language, and there's only 2 words that I remember from that language, was juku and chepos, which is a form of tamales, sweet tamales. But here again, where's the rest of the language? And that would have been nice to just even listen to more. And they would carry on about, how you said that in a certain language. Little bit layers of that as you're going through it.
So I can see that affecting your work.
Yeah, you can see it. Yeah, where do you put this? What kind of categories you put it? And you can see when you come to a country like this where order is spatial. It has a whole different. Well, I'll give you an example. I asked my stepsister once. I said, she's in Mexico. I said, I really would like to know a little bit about of our ancestors or what have you. And she went out the door and says, see those people? There they are. They're right in front of you. I mean, that's how they saw history. It's now, not something in the past. So it's strange how, and then of course recorded history had to do more with the idea of archives, libraries, and in small towns they didn't have this stuff. There were no libraries there. In fact, when I remember it's Michoacan, they didn't have any library. In fact, when I did go to school there, they didn't have any books. What they would do is you walked in there, and you took a notebook, and you took notes. The teacher would rattle out what you were supposed to, and you memorized all this stuff. And in fact, I still remembered a little bit of the life of Miguel Hidalgo Costilla. And it was funny, to this day, I still remember. It was Don Miguel Hidalgo Costilla nació en Hacienda de Corralejo, and on and on. But and then you wrote it down and you put it down, and you learned all of this through that kind of methods. And so by the time you had piles of notebooks with all this information, so in a sense you had to write out your own book. So it's interesting, and it was good. I think good practice because through that kind of method, you wrote and you remembered, and you became more responsible than allowing the book to do it. So it was pretty good that way.
I just want to go back to something you said and clarify. You said that when your family first arrived, or you were born in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And the railroad had cars set up for
Yep.
the families that worked. And then the family moved to a different place, a home. So the first home where you were born was actually in housing provided.
You're right.
Is that how?
Yeah. Because as I mentioned before, it says on my birth certificate, born in a CBQ boxcar next to the state fish hatchery. So the Mississippi River it was only about a mile away from our house.
What's SBQ?
Chicago, Berlin, and Quincy. It was the rail company. Yeah. So, yeah. And as we worked there, we could see the people working there. My dad was right close by most of the time, and they were running back and forth, repairing the ties, trains. And I think I remember once when Truman came through in that area, because at that time the railroads were the place for traveling, in 1948. And so it was strange, because also I get to see before they were put away was the steam engines, because the steam engines there was called a roundhouse where they came in and they were, I would say, maintained, oiled, greased, and all the other stuff. My brother actually worked there doing some of that kind of work.
And I just want to ask you a general question about the art world.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any observations about changes that you've seen in American art since you've been working in it, through the 50s, the 60s, and up through today? Can you generalize or
I think yes, I could
personalize or?
I think one of the problems we left, we came through a period of, particularly the 70s, where the idea of individuality was become very important. But individuality, is particularly in mainstream American art, was to the point, where do you get a job even if you get an MFA? So that was a problem. So you land up with a situation where artists are forced to be marketable. Okay, you have to market, and I don't blame them. In the galleries, museums, they have to make a living too. So down the line, so you have, I think, a funnel vision of what's going in that area. So it's a little loss of independence and individuality in works of art. And my attitude in reference to that was this: Eastern Washington University subsidized my art career, so I never really had a gallery. But it allowed me to do what I wanted to do, okay? So good or bad, life goes on. And on the other hand, you have the Chicano movement, which again became very focused on certain kind of issues, community issues. So you have a marketable, well, it's not necessarily marketable, thank God. Some of them are making it and making some money on it. Martinez, Cesar Martinez, and a few other ones. They're really good artists. They're around. I like their work. But it's strange again, because if you see the patterns of both mainstream American art and the Chicano art, they're in two different schools. They're divided. In fact, I was just a juror for outdoor sculpture for the state of Washington in Olympia about a month ago. And we went through 200 artists, sculptures. That's 10 slides from each one of them. So we're sitting there looking at slides. But you could see it through the whole thing, a whole pattern of it. Now, if you try to put Chicano art in that kind of context, it would work. Okay, so you can see the situation with what I think Chicano art has done is brought it more to a community level, which I think we tend to forget sometimes in the mainstream American art. And because there are necessary, politics are not involved. There are politics, but it's kind of hidden. What's important here is the aesthetics of art, and it becomes a whole different picture or idea where there are necessary no politics, no philosophy about it. You know, it's like looking at a Rothko. You know, where's the American people? And there's nothing. You know, it has to do with the idea of quiet spaces, more spiritual perhaps than you might think of. And Andy Warhol, where he documents more of the changes in America, where anything can become art, you know, attitude, or that type of idea. So you have all these different camps, you might say, in the American situation. And I have tried to negotiate between those two, between Chicano and the mainstream. And I think the piece down in the show right now, does it really look Chicano? It doesn't. You know, could be mainstream out? It could be. You know, so you can see I've worked within those kind of, between those kind of cultural elements about it. I think the Aslan and Masaya is closer to Chicano, yet it brings in both American eyeballs by stating, you know, where's the place, you know, where is it, that type of idea. So, combines it.
Is there any area that we haven't covered that you'd like to think about, or anything on your mind that before we close?
No, I think, you know, perhaps eventually, you know, if there's ever a retrospect, it looks like what I'm thinking. They're going to see exactly what I'm thinking. Well, when did he do this? It doesn't relate to that. It doesn't relate to that. It doesn't relate to that. So there's different venues in my own life. But what's important is, and my philosophy was, I enjoy making art, and even to this day. And so I never see it as work. If it's work, I don't want it. I always used to tell my students, you know, you have to enjoy what you're doing. And if you don't, stop because it's work. You know, you really have to get into it. And I always felt that about much of my work. You know, it's my meditation on life. It's my way of life. It's my survival skills. It's all that. You know, it's my lifestyle. So it has a little to do with that.
Now that you're retired, hopefully you can just...
Well, yeah, now I want to do everything.
There's too much.
Yeah, but there's too much. You know, where do I start? You know, I started a whole series of wood sculptures, and just recently, and I finished 22 of them for a one-man show. But these are all painted wood ones. Now I'm working on just plain wood with no paint on. So I've got about, I think 11 or 12, and I've got about 8 or 9 more to go. So I could have two different exhibitions.
Well, thank you so much for giving us this interview and taking the time. And I hope that we'll see you back here in South Bend.
Oh, great. What a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I really enjoyed this. And the people here are just marvelous.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.